You need to understand the organization from the top down. Hey, I am Chuck the bureaucrat, and today I'm going to try to lay out as simply and as clearly in one page the top-level organization of the Army. These are essentially the different sub-elements of the Army that a service member can be a part of. And while this should be useful in the blood sport of Pentagon budgets, the real reason I'm doing this is because of how it plays into your retirement. As you'll see in a second, retirees never actually leave the Army. They simply move to a different part of the Army. And I make this point because I've bumped into a lot of people who seem to think they are getting out of the Army when they retire. They tend to get blindsided by issues that only really make sense once you understand that nobody gets out. Okay, at the top level, you have the uniformed services. This includes the Armed Forces, the Commissioned Corps of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, that's NOAA, and the Public Health Service. Of course, the biggest part of that is the Armed Forces with the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, and that gets us to the Army. No surprise here that the Army that we're talking about is the Army that is described in the U.S. Constitution. What I find interesting here is that there is mention of the Air Force, but not of the Space Force. This is one of those minor legislative edits that's going to happen sometime in the future. Anyways, the Army consists of three components: the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve. Now, those of you eagle-eyed National Guard folks will notice that I gently edited this text. That's because I am going to gloss over some of the finer nuances of the Army National Guard in this video. That's not a diss. I mean, frankly, I think that the professional Army officer who is uninformed about the Army National Guard risks serious professional blunders. So while I'm going to focus on the breakdown of the Army Reserve, keep in mind that, as always, there's more to the story. Okay, back to the regular Army. Of course, it's made up of the officers and enlisted of the regular Army, plus the professors and the cadets at West Point, and the retired officers and enlisted from the regular Army. See, retirees don't get out of the Army. Next, each armed force has a ready reserve, a standby reserve, and a retired reserve. There is an interesting chronology to the development of these sub-elements, but that's a topic for a different video. Now, I want to stop and just point out something interesting about the definition of the standby reserve. The partitioning is pretty simplistic, but notice the reference to the mobilization authorities, 12301 and 12306. There is a complex tiering of mobilization authorities that underpin all of these categories. Okay, the Ready Reserve breaks down into two distinct pieces: the Selected Reserve and the Individual Ready Reserve. There is something like the Individual Ready Reserve within the National Guard, but like I said, I'm glossing over that. Finally, the Selected Reserve breaks down into a couple of duty statuses that I'm going to summarize quickly. Active Guard and Reserve, AGRs, are members of the Selected Reserve who are on continuous active duty in support of the reserves. TPUs are the so-called drilling reservists. These are the people most frequently envisioned when somebody talks about the reserve components. Military technicians, or MILTECs, are civilian government employees, typically GS, who are members of the reserve component as a condition of their employment. MILTECs have a long history of service, along with some organizational friction points, but again, that's a story for another video. And then, at least within the U.S. Army Reserve, there is a final category called Individual Mobilization Augmentee. These are drilling reservists who fill positions on regular Army force structure documents. Okay, so what? Well, many of you are going to move between these different sub-elements without it really being obvious that you never actually leave the Army. And as always, it helps to understand the terrain on which you maneuver. And if you want to see the ways in which these divisions drive Pentagon work, watch this video.